My sons didn't even let me say goodbye to my husband at his funeral. I stood there begging for just one moment beside his coffin, and they pushed me away. A week later, they told me I wasn't invited to the will reading either. "It's only for the heirs," they said, smiling like I was no one. That was the moment I realized something inside me had died too. But I didn't fight them. I didn't shout or cry. I went home, opened the safe my husband told me never to touch until the day came, and I found what he left behind: the truth. So when they sat in that lawyer's office, ready to divide what they thought was theirs, I walked in with that folder in my hands. They had no idea what was coming. That morning was colder than usual, even for Michigan in winter. The air felt heavy and sharp. I remember holding my gloves and thinking about how many times I had walked into that same church with Thomas, always hand in hand, always together. But this time I was alone. The man I had loved for more than 40 years was gone, and somehow I wasn't sure I was welcome to say goodbye. When I reached the church steps, I saw my son standing by the entrance. Nathan was greeting people, shaking hands, nodding as if this was some sort of business event. His wife, Sophie, was next to him, her face calm and polite, her tone rehearsed. "Mom," she said softly but firmly, "maybe you should sit in the back. The front is for immediate family." I looked at her and didn't know what to say. Immediate family. I wanted to tell her that I was his wife, that no one in that building had a closer claim to that man than I did, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. I just nodded. Eric stood a few steps behind them, pretending not to notice me. His wife, Claire, kept her eyes on the floor. It was as if I was invisible. Inside, the organ was playing. People were already seated. I started walking down the aisle, slowly, trying to keep my balance. My hands were shaking. I wanted to sit near the coffin, to be close to Thomas, to look at him one last time. But when I reached the third row, Nathan stepped in front of me. He put his hand on my arm and said in a quiet voice, "Mom, please, let's not make a scene today." His words hit harder than anything I'd ever heard. I looked at him and didn't recognize him. There was no anger in his face, just cold control. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I turned around and walked to the back of the church. The sound of my heels echoed, and every step felt like proof that I didn't belong there anymore. I sat alone in the last row. From there, I could barely see the coffin. People kept turning their heads, whispering. They knew who I was, and they were probably wondering why I was sitting so far back. No one asked. No one offered me a seat closer. That silence hurt more than words could. When the priest started talking about Thomas, his kindness, his love for his family, I wanted to stand up and shout, "That's not how our sons see me." But I didn't. I stayed quiet, folding my hands in my lap, staring at the wedding ring I still wore. I turned it slowly around my finger, the same way I used to when I was nervous, back when Thomas was still alive and everything made sense. At some point, the memories came back all at once. The first time I met Thomas at the harbor, the small apartment we rented when we were young, the nights we spent waiting for his ship to return. We built everything together, and I thought our boys had seen that. I thought they understood what family meant. Sitting there in that church, watching them look through me like I was a stranger, I realized they didn't. Somewhere, along the way, I had lost them, and I didn't even know when it happened. When the priest asked everyone to stand for the final prayer, I couldn't get up right away. My knees were weak. People began lining up to pass the coffin to say their last goodbyes. I waited until the crowd thinned out, then slowly walked to the front. I just wanted a moment alone with Thomas. I wanted to touch his hand, to whisper something only he would hear. But before I could, Nathan moved again, blocking my way. "You've had your moment, Mom," he said, his voice low but firm. Eric was beside him, looking down, saying nothing. I waited, thinking one of them would step aside. Neither did. I looked at the coffin just a few feet away and felt something close inside me. I didn't cry. I just stood there, breathing slowly, staring at the man I had shared my whole life with, and realizing that the people we raised had become strangers. Sophie was watching me from the front row, her face calm, almost bored. Claire was whispering something to Eric, maybe telling him to end this. I couldn't hear. I didn't care. I turned around and walked out. Outside, the air hit my face like a wall. The snow was falling harder now, soft, but endless. I walked down the steps, holding onto the railing because my hands were shaking. Across the street, I saw Walt, our neighbor for more than 20 years. He was standing next to his old truck, holding his hat against his chest. When our eyes met, he nodded. That was all. No words, no questions, just understanding. I nodded back and kept walking until I reached the edge of the lake. The water was frozen, still and silent. The wind was the only sound. I stared at the ice, thinking about the nights Thomas and I used to sit out here, drinking coffee, talking about the boys, about the future. He always said the lake never lied. One day, Lily, he used to tell me, the lake will tell the truth. I could almost hear his voice saying it again. I whispered, "Not today, Thomas. Not yet." I stood there for a long time. My fingers were numb, but I didn't move. For a few minutes, I didn't feel like a person at all, just a shell of someone who used to have a family. The cold made it easier not to cry. When the church doors closed behind me, I knew that sound would stay with me forever. It wasn't just a door closing. It was the end of something that had taken me a lifetime to build. When everyone was gone, I walked back to my car. I sat inside with my hands on the wheel, staring at the road ahead. I didn't start the engine right away. I kept thinking about what had just happened, how my own sons had treated me like I didn't exist, how they had turned my grief into something inconvenient. There was no anger, not yet. Just a quiet, hollow feeling, like a space waiting to be filled. Before I drove off, I looked at my wedding ring again. I held it tight until it pressed into my skin. That ring had seen everything, the good years, the fights, the silences, the moments we thought we wouldn't make it. And now it was the only thing left that still connected me to Thomas. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this wasn't the end. Not for me, not for him. As I drove away, I passed the church one last time. The doors were closed, the windows dark. Behind them, my sons were probably laughing with their wives, shaking hands with the guests, pretending everything was fine. But they had no idea what Thomas had told me before he died. They didn't know about the safe. They didn't know about the papers he had hidden away, the ones he said I would need someday. That day had come. That night, the house was too quiet. I kept waiting to hear Thomas clear his throat from the living room, or the sound of the television he always left on too loud. But there was nothing, just the ticking of the clock and the wind pushing against the windows. I made tea because I didn't know what else to do. The kettle whistled too sharply in the silence. When I sat down at the kitchen table, the steam from the cup fogged my glasses, and for a second I saw 2 chairs instead of one. His chair was still pulled out slightly, the way he always left it. The one next to it was smaller, Nathan's old seat from when he was a boy. I couldn't bring myself to move either of them. I used to sit there late at night when Thomas was between jobs, grading papers by lamplight while the boys slept. Money was tight back then, and I taught evening classes just to keep food on the table. Thomas would come home tired, smelling of salt and engine oil, his hands rough and cold. We'd sit here drinking tea, pretending things would get better soon. They always did somehow. We made it work. Now there was no one to talk to. No sound except the wind and the creak of the floor when I shifted in my chair. The tea went cold before I touched it. I stared at those 2 empty chairs until the room blurred. On the table, under the lamp, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A folded envelope with my name written in Thomas's handwriting. I froze. He always wrote in a particular way, with the T slanting forward and the lines uneven. I reached out and touched the paper like it might disappear if I wasn't careful. The envelope was yellowed a little at the edges. I opened it slowly. Inside, there was a short note written in his familiar voice. For when they show you who they truly are. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. I read the line again. He had known. He had seen this coming. The cold looks, the distance, the way our sons had turned into men I barely recognized. At the bottom of the note, there was a small brass key taped to the paper, and under it, a folded slip with just a few words. Ruth McKay, call her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the key in my hand. I remembered him mentioning a safe once, years ago, tucked away somewhere in his office. He had said it was for when the time comes, and I thought he was talking about insurance papers or documents. But this felt different. The clock struck midnight. The sound echoed through the empty house. I looked around. Every corner of that room carried memories. The chipped mug Thomas always used, the photograph of us on the shelf from the summer we built the dock. Everything felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood up and walked to the window. The lake outside was covered in ice, the moonlight spreading across it in silver lines. The same lake where Thomas used to fish, where he said the water could tell you the truth, if you listened long enough. I held the key tighter, my fingers cold against the metal. You saw it coming, didn't you, Thomas? I said quietly. The wind pushed harder against the windows, and for a second it almost sounded like an answer. The letter from Thomas stayed on my kitchen table all night. I barely slept. I kept waking up thinking about his words, for when they show you who they truly are. By morning, I knew what he meant. The phone calls from Nathan, and Eric never came after the funeral. No one asked how I was, no one stopped by. But I heard from a cousin later that day that there was going to be a will reading at the lawyer's office. My name wasn't on the list. They didn't even bother to tell me. I put on my black coat, the same one I had worn to the funeral, and drove into town. The snow had started again, thin and steady, like ash falling from the sky. The lawyer's office was on the corner near the old post office, a small brick building with a brass sign that said McKay and Associates. I hadn't been there in years, but I remembered the name. Ruth McKay? The woman Thomas told me to call. When I walked in, the room was already full. My sons were there with their wives, sitting together at the long table like they owned the place. A few distant relatives I barely recognized were whispering near the back. There was coffee on the sideboard, untouched. The air smelled like paper and cold air from the open door. Nathan saw me first. His smile disappeared. "Mom," he said, standing halfway up, "this meeting is for heirs only." His voice was polite, but the words were sharp. Eric didn't even look at me. Sophie crossed her arms. Claire avoided eye contact. I didn't answer right away. I took off my gloves, set my purse down, and walked to the table. My legs felt heavy, but my hands were steady. I pulled out the folder Thomas had left me and placed it in front of the woman sitting at the head of the table. She was older than I remembered, her gray hair tied back neatly, glasses sliding down her nose. "Mrs. McKay?" I said quietly. She looked up, and when she recognized me, something in her face softened. "Lillian," she said. "I was wondering when you'd come." Nathan frowned. "Wait, you know her?" Ruth nodded. "Your father and I worked together years ago. He asked me to handle some things personally." The room went still. I could feel everyone watching. Ruth opened the folder and started reading. For a long moment there was no sound except the faint hum of the heater. Her eyes moved back and forth across the pages, slower and slower, until she finally set the papers down. "This," she said quietly, looking at me. "This changes everything." Nathan leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She adjusted her glasses, took a deep breath, and said, "It means your father prepared a second will, a final, legally binding version, and this one names only one heir." Eric's chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That's not possible," he said. "Dad showed us his will. He said everything would be divided equally." Ruth kept her tone calm. "What he showed you was a draft. This document was signed and notarized 3 months before his passing." Sophie turned pale. Claire whispered something to Eric, her voice shaking. Nathan just stared at me like he was trying to figure out how this could be happening. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Ruth continued, "According to this version, all assets, the house, the savings, the investments, are left entirely to Mrs. Lillian Shore." The room fell silent. You could hear the snow outside hitting the window. For a moment, no one moved. Then Nathan laughed once, short and bitter. "You're telling me my mother gets everything?" "That's absurd. She must have talked him into this." Ruth looked him straight in the eye. "Your father was completely sound of mind. He made this decision of his own will. He even wrote a statement explaining why." Eric slammed his hand on the table. "He wouldn't do that to us." Ruth didn't flinch. "He did." The anger in the room was thick. Sophie muttered something under her breath about manipulation. Claire wiped at her eyes, pretending to cry. I sat there, quiet, watching all of them unravel. It was strange. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. Nathan turned to me, his voice rising. "How could you do this, Mom? Everything we built, everything Dad worked for." I cut him off. "Everything your father and I built," I said. "We built it together long before you ever existed." He went quiet. Ruth slid a single page across the table. This letter was left with the will. He asked that it be read aloud. I nodded. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. Thomas's handwriting filled the page, uneven and familiar. His voice came back to me in every word. "If you're hearing this, then you've already shown your mother who you truly are. I've seen the way you speak to her, the way you dismiss her. I won't reward cruelty. Everything I leave behind is for Lillian. She stood by me when we had nothing. She'll know what to do. When Ruth finished, the silence was heavier than before. Nathan's face was red. Eric was staring at the floor. No one said a word. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I looked at my sons, the men I had carried, fed, loved, forgiven. They wouldn't meet my eyes. "You may call me Mother," I said quietly, "but you stopped treating me like one long ago." No one moved. I picked up my coat, turned to Ruth, and said, "Thank you." As I walked out, the room stayed silent. Behind me, the only sound was the steady ticking of the old wall clock, the sound of time running out for people who thought they had all of it. The day after the reading, I went back to the house. It felt strange walking into the same rooms Thomas used to fill with noise, the sound of his boots, his voice calling from the hallway, the smell of his pipe near the porch. Everything was still, frozen in time. I hadn't touched his study since the day he died. That was where the safe was. It was in the corner, behind the old map of Lake Michigan. The key he left in the envelope fit perfectly. When I turned it, the lock clicked like it had been waiting for me. Inside, there were a few files, a leather-bound notebook, and a small wooden box. The notebook was old, the kind he used to take with him when he worked on ships. The cover smelled faintly of salt and oil. His handwriting filled every page. It was his logbook, a sailor's journal written during the last 2 years of his life. I sat down and started reading. The first entries were ordinary, weather notes, repair lists, thoughts about the lake. But a few pages later, the tone changed. The words grew heavier. He wrote about Nathan and Eric, about the distance between them, about the way they talked when they thought he wasn't listening. They talk about inheritance as if I were already gone. My hands shook a little when I read that line. He had heard them, the same cold tone, the same impatience I had tried to ignore. He went on. Lily still defends them. She doesn't see what I see. They love what we built, not the hands that built it. I stopped reading for a moment. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall filled the silence. He had written everything, every disappointment, every observation. He had seen their greed long before I did, and even then, his words weren't angry. They were sad. "I don't want her to be left fighting after I'm gone," he wrote. "She has fought enough. I'll make sure she's safe, even if she hates me for it at first." I closed the journal and pressed my hand over the cover. It felt like touching his heart. When I brought the notebook to Ruth's office the next morning, she took it gently, like it was something sacred. She spent hours reviewing the documents from the safe, checking the signatures, the notary stamps, the dates. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was serious but calm. "It's all valid," she said, "every page, every signature. The will in that folder is the final, legal version. You're the sole heir, Lillian. No one can change that." I didn't say anything for a while. The words didn't bring relief, just silence. I thought about Thomas sitting at his desk, writing those words alone, knowing what he was doing, knowing what it would mean. Ruth closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "He must have trusted you completely," she said softly. "He wanted to protect my peace," I replied. "He knew what they'd become." Ruth studied me for a moment. "Do you want revenge or peace?" she asked quietly. I looked out the window. The snow was melting now, small streams running along the street. The question stayed in the air between us. I thought about Nathan and Eric, their anger, their shock, the way they had looked at me as if I were the enemy. I thought about the years I spent trying to earn their love, the dinners, the holidays, the quiet forgiveness that never changed anything. Finally, I said, "Justice. Just justice." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then you already have it." She handed me the journal back. I held it to my chest and took a deep breath. It wasn't victory I felt, it was the weight of truth. When I got home that night, I placed the journal on Thomas's chair at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I poured a cup of tea and sat across from him as if we were still having one of our late-night talks. "I found it, Thomas," I whispered. "Everything you left for me." The wind moved softly through the cracks in the window. Somewhere outside, the frozen lake made a low, distant sound, a groan, almost like a voice. I didn't cry this time. I just sat there, calm and steady, holding on to the truth he had left behind. He hadn't written those words out of anger. He had written them out of love, the kind that protects even when it hurts. The auction was supposed to be private, but it wasn't. Word had spread all over Traverse that Thomas Shore's collection was being sold. They called it the legacy sale. When I arrived, there were cameras outside and people holding programs with his picture printed on the cover. My husband's face, smiling, used as decoration for something that never should have happened. Inside the town hall, the lights were too bright. Rows of chairs filled the room. On the stage stood my son, Nathan, wearing his father's old Navy blazer. He looked proud, confident, almost like a politician. Beside him, Eric stood a little further back, pretending to be humble. Their wives sat in the front row, whispering to people from the local paper. Walt was next to me at the back of the room. He had his hat in his hands, the same one he wore to the funeral. "You sure you want to do this, Lily?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Someone has to." The auctioneer started talking, his voice echoing through the hall. "Today we celebrate the legacy of Captain Thomas Shore, sailor, husband, father, and local hero." Every word cut a little deeper. They were using his name like a brand, like something to make money from. I folded my hands together and kept my eyes on the stage. The first item was a pocket watch, the same one Thomas wore every day for 30 years. "Starting bid, $500, the man called. Hands went up. The bids climbed quickly. A man in the front row laughed when he won it for $1,200. He had no idea Thomas used to wind that watch every night before bed. Next came a framed map of Lake Michigan, hand-drawn by Thomas. I remembered helping him hang it in his office the year we moved into our house. He said the map reminded him of home no matter where he sailed. The auctioneer's voice rose again. "Starting bid, $1,000. Another stranger's hand went up. Beside me, Walt shook his head. "They're not selling things, Lily," he whispered. "They're selling the man you loved." I felt my throat tighten. He was right. Every object that left that stage was another piece of my life being erased. Then they brought out the ship model, the Odessa. Thomas built it by hand when Nathan was little. He used to let the boys help paint the hull. Nathan smiled now, proud, telling the story to the crowd like it was his. "My father taught us patience," he said into the microphone. "Every detail of this model reminds me of him." The audience clapped. Cameras flashed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to shout that he hadn't touched that model in years, that he hadn't spoken to his father without asking for money. But I didn't. I stayed still, my hands cold and steady. Then the auctioneer lifted the last item. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we close today's event with the Sea Journal, the personal logbook of Captain Shore, written during his final years. Starting bid, $2,000, the crowd murmured. Reporters raised their cameras. Walt turned to me. "Lily," he whispered. But I was already moving. My feet felt heavy, but my steps were sure. I walked down the aisle, past the rows of people, past the lights. The auctioneer looked startled. "Ma'am, please." I didn't stop. I reached the stage, looking at the journal in his hands, Thomas's handwriting visible even from a distance. My voice shook a little, but I spoke clearly. "That journal isn't yours to sell?" The room went silent. You could hear the cameras clicking. The auctioneer froze, unsure what to do. Nathan leaned toward the microphone. "Mom," he said with a practiced smile, "you gave up your rights when you walked away from the family." I turned to him slowly. "I never walked away," I said. "You closed the door." The words came out calm, but they carried everything. The funeral, the humiliation, the years of being treated like I didn't matter. For a moment, Nathan didn't move. Then he tried to laugh it off. "Mom, please, this is not the time." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder, the same one Ruth had given back to me, the one with Thomas's signature and the notary seals. I placed it on the podium and opened it so everyone could see. "This belongs to me," I said, my voice louder now, steady. "To his wife, the only one who never left his side." The audience murmured. Reporters began snapping pictures faster. The auctioneer backed away, glancing at Nathan for direction. Ruth appeared at the side of the stage. She must have come through the back door. I hadn't even noticed her. She walked straight to me and took the papers. "This is the official document," she said clearly. "Certified, signed, and witnessed. Captain Shore's assets and personal property are not for public sale. The auction is void." The hall fell into chaos. People stood up, whispering, arguing. Nathan's face turned pale. Eric muttered something to his wife. The cameras caught everything, every reaction, every movement. Walt came up beside me, his voice low. "It's over, Lily. You did it." I nodded but didn't look at anyone. My eyes were on the journal in the auctioneer's hands. May I have it, please? I asked. He handed it to me carefully. When I touched the cover, I felt the texture of the leather, the weight of all the words inside. For a moment, the noise faded. The lights, the cameras, the whispers, all disappeared. I was back in our kitchen again, hearing Thomas's voice say goodnight, feeling his hand on mine. I turned to the crowd, holding the journal close to my chest. This isn't about money, I said. It's about respect. The cameras clicked again. I didn't care. I stepped off the stage and walked toward the exit. Walt followed, staying a few steps behind. As I reached the door, I looked back one last time. Nathan was still on the stage, his face red, his mouth open like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I didn't wait. I pushed the door open and walked into the cold air. Outside, the snow had stopped and the lake was calm again. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. Walt put his hand gently on my shoulder. You okay? I'm fine, I said quietly. I just needed to bring him home. The room didn't calm down right away. People were standing, whispering, turning to one another. Reporters were filming. The auctioneer didn't know whether to keep speaking or step away. I stood on the stage holding Thomas's journal, and for a moment I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Then Ruth walked forward. Her heels echoed across the wooden floor as she approached the microphone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room fell quiet on its own. This, she said, holding up the folder I'd given her, is the official, notarized testament of Captain Thomas Shore. It is certified, witnessed, and legally binding. Mrs. Lillian Shore is the sole heir. The silence that followed broke into waves of murmurs. Some people gasped, others clapped softly, unsure if they should. Nathan froze where he stood. Eric dropped his head into his hands. Sophie stood up, her face red, and shouted from the front row. She manipulated him while he was dying. Ruth didn't even flinch. She looked straight at her and said, "He was perfectly lucid when he signed this. I was there. I spoke with him myself." The crowd started to stir again, but this time it wasn't in anger. It was in support. Someone in the back clapped louder, and then others joined in. A woman in her 50s, maybe someone from town, stood up and said clearly, "About time someone like her wins." I didn't smile, but I felt something inside me loosen. For years, I had been invisible. Now people were seeing the truth, and it wasn't because I shouted. It was because Thomas had trusted me enough to leave the truth written down. Nathan slammed his hand against the table. "You're destroying this family," he shouted. I turned toward him, still holding the journal against my chest. "No," I said softly. "I'm just ending the lie." The cameras caught every word. The flashes were blinding. I could see people's faces in the light, some angry, some moved, others just watching as if they had never seen a mother stand up to her sons before. Ruth cleared her throat and continued, her tone calm but firm. "There's one more thing," she said. "Captain Shore added a special clause to his will." Nathan looked up sharply. "What clause?" Ruth flipped through the papers. "It states that any child or relative who attempts to contest this testament or question Mrs. Shore's mental capacity will lose the small monthly allowance they were granted." The room fell silent again. You could hear the sound of a pen rolling off a table somewhere in the back. Ruth closed the folder. "This clause is legally binding. Once violated, it cannot be reversed." Sophie's face went pale. Claire whispered something to Eric, her voice shaking. The reporters were writing fast, their cameras flashing again. I could see the panic start to replace the anger on my sons' faces. Nathan stepped forward, trying to regain control. "You can't do this," he said. "You can't just erase us." I looked at him and felt something that wasn't hate, it was sorrow. "You did that yourself," I said, "when you chose greed over love." He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words hung between us like a wall neither of us could cross anymore. Ruth placed her hand lightly on my arm. "Mrs. Shore," she said, "it's done. You don't need to say anything else." But I did. Not for them, for myself. I turned toward the crowd. My husband was a good man. He didn't build a fortune to feed pride or competition. He built it to keep this family together. But when kindness is taken for weakness, love can only survive if it's protected. He knew that. And now you all do too. The applause came slowly at first, then stronger. Not loud or wild, just steady, honest. The kind of clapping that means people understood. I felt my hands shake a little, and Ruth gently took the journal from me before I dropped it. Nathan sat down hard in his chair. Sophie turned away from him. Eric kept his eyes on the floor. The press was already moving closer, shouting questions, snapping more photos. I could hear someone say my name. "Mrs. Shore, how do you feel?" But I didn't answer. I just stepped down from the stage, one step at a time. At the bottom, Walt was waiting. He had his hands in his pockets, his hat tilted slightly back, his eyes shining like he'd been holding his breath through the whole thing. "You did it, Lily," he said quietly. "You faced the storm." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "I didn't want to," I said. "But Thomas did." Walt smiled. "He'd be proud. You gave him back his name." Outside, the air was crisp. The crowd spilled out of the hall, still talking, still buzzing from what they had witnessed. Some people came up to shake my hand, to tell me I did the right thing. I nodded and thanked them, but my mind was somewhere else. On the lake, on the quiet of home, on the sound of Thomas's voice in my head telling me that peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for. Walt and I stood by the doors for a while, watching the reporters pack up their equipment. When the last one left, I turned back to the empty hall. The stage lights were still on. The folder lay on the table where Ruth had left it. For the first time in a long time, I felt the air in my lungs go in easily, without the weight of shame or anger. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't a battle. It was just the truth standing on its own, no longer buried under noise. The crowd was thinning out, but the air in the hallway still felt thick. The lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere behind us the echo of clapping still lingered. I held Thomas's journal against my chest as I walked toward the exit. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. Then I heard Nathan's voice behind me. "You turned Dad against us," he shouted. The hallway went quiet again. Reporters turned their cameras toward him. His face was red, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. For the first time, I saw not the confident man from the stage, but the boy he used to be, the boy who hated being told no. I turned around slowly. "Your father made his own choices," I said. He stepped closer. "You filled his head with lies. You made him believe we didn't love him." "You did that yourselves," I replied. My voice was calm. He saw the truth before I ever said a word. For a moment I thought he might cry, but he just clenched his jaw instead. Eric was standing behind him, silent, his face pale. He looked at me, then at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "We just wanted to be part of something again," he said quietly. "We thought if we took care of the inheritance, it would mean he trusted us. We didn't mean to shut you out, Mom. We just—" His voice trailed off. "We didn't know how to come back." I looked at him for a long moment. "You don't come back through greed, Eric. You come back through honesty." He nodded slowly, eyes wet, but Nathan turned on him. "Don't start feeling sorry for her," he snapped. "She took everything from us." Sophie stepped forward then, her voice sharp and high. She was holding a folded newspaper, the kind that printed gossip before facts. She threw it onto the floor between us. "You'll ruin us, you bitter old woman," she hissed. "Our names are everywhere. People are laughing at us. You couldn't just stay quiet, could you?" I looked down at the paper. My picture was on the front, me standing on the stage holding Thomas's journal. The headline read, "Widow reclaims late captain's legacy." When I looked up again, my voice came out steady. "You ruined yourselves when you priced love." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The hallway seemed to shrink. Even the reporters held their breath. Then Walt stepped between us. His coat was still covered in snow, his voice low but sharp. "Show some respect," he said. "She buried the man you're selling." Nathan glared at him. "This is none of your business." Walt didn't move. "You made it everyone's business the moment you dragged his name into the papers." Nathan's shoulders fell, but his eyes still burned. For a moment I thought he might lunge or say something worse, but he didn't. He just turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You think you've won," he muttered. "You'll see what it feels like when people forget you too." I took a step closer, holding the journal tightly. "I don't need them to remember me," I said. "I just need to remember who I am." Eric wiped his face, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly. "I really am." I nodded. "I know." He hesitated, then walked past me, out into the snow. Nathan followed a moment later, dragging Sophie with him. The photographers followed, their flashes lighting up the hallway in bursts of white. Then, one by one, they disappeared. The sound that filled the silence afterward wasn't applause or shouting. It was the wind outside, howling through the cracks in the door. It sounded almost like the lake again. Ruth walked over, carrying her folder close to her chest. "It's done, Lillian," she said quietly. "They can't undo any of it." "I know." She gave me a small smile. "You handled it better than most would." "I've had practice," I said. "You learn to stay still in a storm." She nodded, then touched my arm. "Go home. Rest." As she walked away, a young reporter, barely more than 20, stepped forward hesitantly. He held a small recorder in his hand. "Mrs. Shore?" he asked. "May I tell your story?" I studied his face for a second. His eyes were kind, curious but not greedy. "Only if you tell it right," I said. He nodded, almost like he understood what that meant. Then he stepped back, lowering his recorder. Walt walked up beside me as the last of the crowd cleared out. The floor was littered with papers, programs, and half-melted snow. The bright lights from the hall still spilled through the doorway, but out here in the corridor everything felt dim, quiet, and honest. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. I looked down at Thomas's journal again, tracing the edge of the leather with my thumb. The cover was warm from my hand. I felt a strange peace. Not triumph, not relief, just stillness. Walt finally broke the silence. "You did what he couldn't, you know." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He spent his whole life keeping everyone else calm. But you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You faced the storm and walked out of it." I smiled faintly. "He taught me how." Walt adjusted his hat, looked toward the glass doors where the snow was falling harder now. "You walked taller than the storm," he said quietly. I turned toward the exit. Outside, the snow covered everything, the cars, the streets, even the lake in the distance. For a long time, I just watched it fall. When I finally stepped out into it, the cold hit my face, sharp and clean. I didn't mind. Each breath felt like starting over. The flashes from the last cameras faded behind me, replaced by the quiet rhythm of my boots against the snow. I didn't look back. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. It had been a week since the auction, but the story hadn't faded. Every morning, new headlines appeared, some harsh, most sympathetic. The local paper ran it first. "Teacher stands up to her sons at inheritance auction." The title alone was enough to turn heads at the diner, the grocery store, and the post office. People in Traverse were talking. Walt told me that someone at the hardware store said I'd done what half the women in town had only dreamed of, standing up for themselves without raising their voice. Someone else said Thomas would have been proud. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. When I went out for groceries that morning, I could feel eyes following me, but not in a cruel way. Strangers nodded, some smiled softly. A woman I barely knew from church stopped me by the bread aisle and whispered, "Good for you." Back home, I set the paper down on the kitchen table, the same table where Thomas used to drink his morning coffee, where the boys once did their homework, where everything that mattered used to happen. I sat there for a while, just looking at the headline again. Teacher. That word felt strange now. I hadn't taught in years, but I suppose that's how people remembered me. The woman who corrected essays, baked cookies for class fundraisers, and went home to a husband who spent his life at sea. Below the headline was a photo. Me standing on the stage, holding Thomas's journal in one hand and the folder in the other. The lights were bright, my face half in shadow. I didn't look angry or triumphant, just steady. Underneath the photo, the caption read, "Lillian Shore, widow of Captain Thomas Shore, presented the official testament, ending her son's attempt to auction off their father's estate." I took a deep breath. The house was quiet, too quiet. Outside, the lake was covered in thin ice again, the kind that cracked softly when the wind blew. I thought of Thomas then, how he'd always said the lake had a voice of its own, that if you listened long enough, it would tell you the truth. I smiled, a small, tired smile. "Thomas," I said quietly. The lake spoke. The phone rang once that afternoon. It was Ruth checking in. She said the will had been officially recorded and that everything was secure. "You can rest now," she told me. "I think I already am," I said. Before hanging up, she added, "You know, Lillian, stories like yours don't fade fast. People remember the truth when it's quiet and clear. That's what yours was, clear." Later, I heard a knock at the door. It was Walt. He was holding a folded newspaper, smiling the way old friends do when words aren't needed. "You've seen this one?" he asked, stepping in from the cold. He placed it on the table, flattening it out. It was the Traverse Daily Chronicle. The headline read, "The Widow Who Faced the Storm." Beneath it was a full-page photo of me, again, but this time the picture was from the end of that day. I was standing outside the town hall, snow falling all around, the journal clutched to my chest. The caption read, "Her calm was louder than their noise." Walt looked at me. "They got it right this time." I nodded. "Mostly." He laughed softly. "What did they miss?" I took another look at the photo. The snow had been falling hard then, but I remembered the quiet more than the cold. The silence that comes after you've said everything that needed saying. "They missed what it cost," I said finally. He didn't answer. He just sat down across from me, his coat still on, and poured us both a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made earlier. We drank in silence for a while. The radio hummed softly in the background, some old song Thomas used to like. The lake wind pushed against the windows, but inside the house was warm. When Walt finished his coffee, he stood up and pointed at the photo again. "You know," he said, "that picture? It doesn't look like revenge." I smiled faintly. "That's because it isn't." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "That's truth," I said, touching the edge of the newspaper. Truth finally finding air. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the snow began to fall again, light and steady, covering the ground like a clean page. It had been raining since morning, the kind of steady rain that soaks everything without ever turning into a storm. The sky was gray, the lake a sheet of dull silver behind the house. I was making tea when I heard the knock on the door. 3 slow knocks, then silence. For a moment I thought it was Walt, maybe coming by to check the gutters or drop off the newspaper. But when I opened the door, it wasn't him. It was Nathan. He stood there on the porch, his coat dripping, hair plastered to his forehead. Behind him, Eric was a few steps back, holding an umbrella that wasn't doing much good. Sophie was there too, farther away, her arms crossed, her face tight and pale. For a second, no one spoke. The rain hit the porch roof in a steady rhythm. "Mom," Nathan said finally, his voice low. "Can we come in?" I didn't answer right away. The last time I saw them, they were shouting, accusing, throwing words that cut deeper than they knew. Seeing them now, smaller somehow, uncertain, was strange. I opened the door wider but didn't step aside. "You can say what you need to say from there." Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes red. "We were scared," he said, "of losing everything, of being left with nothing." His voice trembled on the last word. "You feared poverty," I said quietly. "I feared losing my soul." He looked down. Eric stepped forward, his umbrella slipping from his hand. He didn't pick it up. "We didn't understand," he said. "We thought you were taking him away from us even after he was gone." "You did that yourselves," I replied. "You stopped seeing your father long before he died. You were too busy counting what you thought you'd inherit." The rain grew louder, filling the silence between us. Eric's lip quivered. He looked like he was trying not to cry, but the tears came anyway. "I miss him," he said. "Every day. I can't sleep without seeing that look he gave us before he got sick. That disappointment. I thought it would fade after he was gone, but it doesn't." I wanted to say I understood, but I couldn't lie. "It shouldn't fade," I said. "Some looks are meant to stay." Nathan's shoulders shook slightly. "Mom. We lost everything. The contracts, the business, the house. No one wants to work with us now. We just wanted to see you." Sophie finally spoke from behind them, her tone sharp and cold. "We wanted to make peace." I looked at her, perfectly composed even in the rain, her words more calculated than heartfelt. "Peace?" I asked. "Or pity?" She said nothing, only stared. Nathan took a shaky breath. "We're not asking for money. We just need a chance to start again, to fix things." I studied his face, older, heavier, but still the same boy who used to argue with me about everything, the same man who once pushed me aside at his father's coffin. I remembered that moment too clearly to pretend it never happened. "You want to fix things?" I said. "Then start with yourselves." He nodded quickly. "We're trying." "Trying," I repeated softly. "That's good. Keep trying. But not here." Eric wiped his face. You won't even talk to us? I am talking to you, I said. Right now. He flinched at that. Nathan opened his mouth to say something else, but I held up my hand. There's nothing more to say. You made your choices, and I made mine. Sophie's patience broke. So that's it? She snapped. You get to walk away clean like you're some kind of saint? I turned my gaze to her, calm but firm. I don't walk away clean. I walk away honest. The rain hit harder now, beating against the steps. Nathan tried to reach for my arm, but I stepped back slightly. Don't, I said quietly. Let this be what it is, the truth between us. He froze, then dropped his hand. The sound of the rain filled the space that words couldn't. I wish it didn't have to end like this, Eric said, barely above a whisper. It ended the moment you forgot who you were talking to, I replied. The moment you started calling me her instead of Mom. He closed his eyes, tears mixing with the rain. Behind them, Sophie let out a frustrated sigh. Come on, she said to Nathan. This was a mistake. Nathan didn't move. He just looked at me one last time. We just wanted you to forgive us, he said. I already did, I told him. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The rain came down heavier, running in small rivers along the porch. Their clothes were soaked. Eric shivered. Sophie turned and started walking toward the car. Nathan hesitated, then followed her. Eric stayed a moment longer. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. Do you ever think about us? Every day, I said. That's what makes it hurt. He nodded slowly, then turned and left. When the door closed, I stood there, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading into the rain. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. I'd already done all the crying I had left in me. I walked back to the window and watched as their car disappeared down the road, the red taillights fading into the gray. The house was quiet again, only the sound of rain on the roof, steady and endless. I whispered to myself, barely audible over the storm, some debts can only be paid in silence. Outside, the rain drowned everything, voices, footsteps, memories, until there was nothing left but the sound of water and the truth it carried. And then even that began to fade. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon. Summer had come early to Traverse, painting the lake in shades of soft blue and gold. The snow was long gone, the grass green again, and the small wooden house by the water had changed too. Where Thomas's tools once hung, now stood easels, canvases, and jars of brushes. The smell of paint filled the air, sharp, alive, familiar. I had turned the old boathouse into something new. I called it the Shoreline Studio. It wasn't meant to be anything big. Just a place where women could come, sit by the lake, and paint for a while. No fees, no judgment, no rules. Maybe it was my way of building something out of the silence that had filled my life for too long. The first morning I opened the doors, I wasn't sure if anyone would show up. I'd put a handwritten sign at the end of the road. Free art classes for women, beginners welcome. The paint on the sign was barely dry, but they came. The first was Dorothy, 70 years old, with thin white hair pulled into a bun and eyes that had seen more winters than joy. She told me, in a small voice, that her daughter-in-law had asked her to find her own space after her husband died. Dorothy said it like a confession, as if she'd done something wrong by getting old. Then there was Maria, 58, freshly divorced after 30 years of marriage. She carried herself like a woman still trying to remember who she was before someone else defined her. She painted slow, careful strokes, always in shades of blue. And Hazel, 63, who'd lost her savings after trusting a cousin with her investments. She laughed too loudly, sometimes cried without warning, but when she painted, her hands stopped shaking. The four of us sat there that first afternoon, surrounded by open windows and the smell of lake air, staring at blank canvases that didn't ask questions or judge us. When I told them to paint whatever came to mind, they all hesitated. It was Dorothy who broke the silence. What if I paint something ugly, she asked. Then we'll frame it anyway, I said. We all laughed a little, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deeper than humor, a release, small but real. By the second week, the studio began to feel alive. There were teacups on the windowsills, half-finished sketches drying on the tables, and old music playing softly from the radio. Sometimes, when I watched them paint, I thought of the woman I had been, the one who waited for permission to live her life, the one who stayed quiet so others could feel comfortable. I didn't want to be her anymore. Walt came by most mornings. He said he was checking the roof, but I knew he came to help. He fixed the windows, brought homemade cookies, and always made sure the kettle was full. He'd pour tea for everyone, then sit by the back door, watching the lake like an old friend. One day, as I was helping Hazel mix colors, Walt stood behind me, drying his hands on a rag. "You turned pain into paint, Lily," he said with a smile. I looked at him, the brush still in my hand. "Maybe peace isn't silence," I said. "It's art." He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. That afternoon, we started working on our first group piece, a large canvas we decided to call The Quiet Lake. Each of us painted a part of it. Dorothy painted the sky, wide and soft, full of light. Maria painted the water, calm but deep. Hazel added a small boat drifting in the distance, and I painted the shoreline, uneven, weathered, but still standing. When it was finished, we stepped back and just stared. The colors didn't match perfectly, but somehow they belonged together. It wasn't flawless, but it was honest, just like us. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't even realized was still tight. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about loss or betrayal or proving anything. I was just there, surrounded by women who understood what it meant to start again when you thought it was too late. The sun was setting outside, spilling gold across the floor. Walt brought out an old wooden frame he'd repaired that morning and started fitting the canvas inside it. He worked quietly, whistling a tune I half recognized from years ago. When he was done, we hung the painting above the doorway. Underneath it, we nailed a small wooden sign I'd written the night before. "Every woman deserves a second horizon." The letters were uneven, the paint smudged, but it felt right. Dorothy touched the sign with her fingertips. "You think we'll ever get ours?" she asked softly. I smiled. "You already have. You're here." Outside, the lake shimmered under the evening sun. The water was still, reflecting the sky in gold and rose. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and pine, and for a moment the whole world felt quiet but not empty. Full, alive. Hazel was cleaning her brushes, humming to herself. Maria stood by the door, watching the light fade over the water. Dorothy was wiping her glasses, her eyes glistening. I poured the last of the tea into our cups, and we sat there in the fading light. 4 women who had lost everything once, finding something again together. I thought of Thomas then, and what he'd written in his journal. The lake never keeps secrets forever. Maybe he was right. The lake had given me back something I didn't know I was missing. Not forgiveness, not revenge, but a new beginning. As the sun slipped behind the trees, the light caught the framed painting above the door, making the colors glow like they were alive. Walt looked at it, then at me. "That's your horizon now," he said. I nodded, smiling softly. "Ours," I said. Outside, the lake reflected the sky, gold turning to pink, pink to violet. The day was ending, but for once, it didn't feel like something was over. It felt like something had just begun. The lake was still that night. Not silent, but calm, the kind of calm that felt earned. The window was open, and the soft wind moved the curtains like someone breathing slowly in their sleep. I sat at the old writing desk by the window, the same one Thomas used to fix his maps on, the one he swore he'd replace but never did. The lamp cast a small circle of light, and in that light lay his journal. The cover was worn now, the leather soft from all the times I'd touched it. I hadn't opened it in weeks. Not since I started the Shoreline studio. I'd told myself I was done with the past, that I'd said everything I needed to say to it. But tonight, for some reason, I wanted to read it again, not to remember, but to listen. When I turned to the last page, my breath caught. I'd read that page before, but it felt different now. His handwriting had faded a little, but I could still see every letter clearly. "When you find peace, you find me." I stared at those words for a long time. I could almost hear his voice saying them, low and steady, like when he used to read to me by the fire. For so long, I thought peace meant silence. No more shouting, no more loss, no more pain. But silence can be heavy too. It can sit on your chest like another kind of grief. I picked up my pen, the same one I used to sign the final papers months ago, and opened a clean page in my own notebook. My hand trembled, but I wrote slowly, carefully, so that every word carried what I truly meant. I found peace, Thomas, and in peace I found myself. When I finished, I looked at the sentence until the ink dried. Then I smiled, not the smile of victory or relief, but something gentler. I folded the page and slipped it between the last pages of his journal. For a moment I held it there, feeling the weight of both, his words and mine, meeting in the middle. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight. I stood up, took the journal in one hand, and walked down the small wooden steps that led to the dock. The boards creaked beneath my feet, just like they always had when he used to wait for me there with his coffee in the mornings. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and water. I sat on the edge of the dock, my bare feet just above the surface. The moon was full, casting a soft silver path across the lake. It looked almost like a road leading somewhere else, maybe where he was. I opened the small wooden box I'd brought with me. Inside were a few white lilies, his favorite flower, and the one that had filled the church the day we said goodbye. I'd kept a few dried petals in a book, but these were fresh from the garden by the studio. I took one bloom in my hand and whispered softly, "This one's for you." Then I set it down on the water. The lily drifted away slowly, spinning gently as the current carried it farther from the dock. I watched until it became a small white dot under the moonlight. I could have cried, but the tears didn't come. Not this time. My heart felt full, not heavy, not empty, just full. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the auction, the studio, the women who now painted with laughter instead of sorrow. It all felt distant now, like an old story I'd finally finished reading. Thomas had been right. The lake had told the truth. It had taken time, storms, and silence, but it had spoken. Not in words, but in peace. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. The night air moved softly against my skin. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, its cry long and low, echoing off the surface. I whispered into the wind, "I'm all right now." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. After a while, I stood up, holding the journal close. I kissed its worn cover once and placed it on the dock beside me. Then I turned and walked back toward the house, my footsteps light against the wood. Before I went inside, I looked back one last time. The lily was almost out of sight, just a faint glimmer in the moonlight, like a memory finally set free. The lake was quiet again, but not empty. It was alive, carrying everything I'd let go of and everything I'd chosen to keep. Inside, the lamp was still on, its warm light spilling over the desk. I sat down, looked at the empty chair beside mine, and smiled. "Good night, Thomas," I said softly. "You can rest now, so can I." The clock ticked once, then fell into rhythm with the sound of the rain starting again in the distance. Soft, familiar, and kind. Outside on the lake, the single white lily floated until the moonlight caught it just right, and for a brief moment it looked like it was glowing. The morning light came slowly, stretching across the lake like a quiet breath. The water was calm, the kind of calm that feels earned after years of storms. Mist floated above the surface, turning everything pale and soft. The curtains moved gently in the wind, and the smell of tea drifted through the wooden house. I sat by the window with my cup, watching the waves roll toward the shore. 6 months had passed since the night I let the lily float away. Everything looked the same, but the silence inside me was different now. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was light. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant letting people back in. I thought if you truly forgave, you had to open the same doors that once hurt you. But forgiveness isn't about reopening what broke you. It's about freeing yourself from it. I don't carry their words anymore. The cruelty, the coldness, the way they looked at me like I was in the way. My sons thought I took something from them. But the truth is, I only took back what was always mine. My peace. There was a time when I believed being a mother meant enduring anything. Keeping quiet, swallowing the pain, pretending the family was whole even when it wasn't. But love without respect isn't love. It's survival. And surviving without peace is just another kind of prison. Laughter echoed from the next room. Dorothy's voice called out, "Lillian, is this the right shade of blue for the lake this morning?" "Almost," I said, smiling. "Add a touch of gold, the kind that hides in the light." I walked into the studio. Sunlight spilled through the open windows, catching the dust in midair. The shoreline studio, once Thomas's boathouse, now smelled of paint and new beginnings. Dorothy was painting the reflection of the sunrise. Maria stood by the window, sketching a small sailboat. Hazel's hands were covered in color as she tried to mix a shade she called forgiveness pink. I looked at them and felt a quiet warmth rise in my chest. These women came to me broken, carrying stories too heavy to tell. Now they were creating beauty out of the pieces that once hurt them. Outside, Walt was hanging a new wooden sign by the door. It read, "Summer Art Fair, all welcome." When he was done, he glanced through the window. Our eyes met. He smiled, just a small one. I smiled back, no words needed. On the front wall hung the framed article from Traverse Daily Chronicle. The headline read, "The Inheritance of Lillian Shore, a Woman Who Chose Dignity Over Blood." Beneath it was the photograph, me standing by the lake, the studio behind me. The caption said, "Yeah, she lost everything, then found herself." Hazel looked at it and laughed softly. "They got that right, didn't they?" "Maybe they did," I said. Outside, the lake shimmered in the sun. The air was full of color and sound, the brush strokes, the soft chatter, the waves moving. Just beyond the window, I ran my fingers over the largest painting in the room, the Quiet Lake. We'd finished it together weeks ago. Walt had framed it in driftwood and hung it by the door. Beneath the painting, carved into the wood, were the words, "Every woman deserves a second horizon." I read it again, whispering to myself. It wasn't just a sentence anymore. It was a truth. We'd all found our second horizon here. Dorothy, who was thrown out by her daughter-in-law. Maria, who left a 30-year marriage. Hazel, who lost everything and started again. And me, who had mistaken silence for peace. Walt came in from outside with 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to me. We sat by the open doorway, looking at the golden water. "You turn pain into something beautiful," he said quietly. "People will see hope here." I nodded. Maybe peace isn't silence after all. Maybe it's creation. He smiled but said nothing. Sometimes the best understanding doesn't need words. As the day grew brighter, the lake glowed like glass. The women laughed inside, arguing gently over color and light. Their voices mixed with the sound of the waves, like music that had always been there but no one had noticed before. I thought of Thomas, of the words he once wrote. The lake never keeps secrets forever. He was right. The lake had told the truth, not through storms or noise, but through calm, through reflection. I took a deep breath and felt the cool wind fill my lungs. There was no anger left, no grief sharp enough to wound. Only softness, only air. "Not forgetting," I whispered, "just no longer hurting." Walt pointed toward the water. "Look, Lily, the light. It's different today." The sun hit the surface just right, turning the lake into a sheet of gold. We stood there side by side, watching it move. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. Not an apology, not justice, not even closure. Just this moment, warm, quiet, alive. This was what peace looked like. Not victory, not revenge, just morning light and the sound of waves. When I turned back toward the studio, the door was open wide. The laughter inside felt like home, the kind you don't lose when people leave, the kind you build when you start again. The waves rolled gently against the shore, steady and familiar, like a promise kept. Peace, I realized, doesn't erase the past. It lets it rest. And when I looked out across the lake one last time, the sunlight broke across the water, glittering in 1,000 tiny ripples. Each one seemed to carry a small piece of the life I'd reclaimed. The quiet, the dignity, the freedom. I smiled. The wind rose and the sound of the waves filled the air, soft, endless, and kind.